So we can go ahead and jump in and introduce ourselves. For those of you who don't know us, as Lindsay said, my name is Brian Flora. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Beyond 20. I've been working in IT for, longer than I'm comfortable admitting, in the IT service management space, and and dealing with a lot of the questions that we're talking about today. Although obviously you'll see on the screen there that in my screenshot or my photo, I have no facial hair at that point, clean and shaven pre-COVID. So, Rook, I don't know if you know this. There have been a couple of studies where they show that people view or perceive men with beards as being more intelligent than clean-shaven men. So,
we got them fooled, don't we?
We do. So my thought here, my ask here for those of you dialing in at home is that, whenever I say something stupid, just focus on the beard. Just, think about that. And yeah, exactly. So, okay. Rook, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, everybody. My name is John Jones. I go by my nickname, Rook. I've been in ITOM and operations management for probably 20, 25, maybe 30 years. And most recently have been awarded the certified technical architect by ServiceNow. I'm also AWS certified in several areas, and I'm looking forward to talking cloud today.
Absolutely. And we're happy to have you here with us at Beyond 20 and certainly on this webinar. So jumping right in. For those of you who are newly exposed to Beyond 20, this is the first webinar you've come to. Just a real quick background on what we do. We are obviously a ServiceNow partner, and we can certainly assist with ServiceNow implementations. We also have partnerships with Cherwell and Avanti, and deep expertise in the process side of things, and everything from data science, data governance, to helping to do maturity assessments, strategic planning. A lot of you, again, come to us for training, for ITIL, for CISSP, for Agile, DevOps, those kinds of things. So those are kind of the main practice areas that that we have as a firm. For those of you on the federal side, we are an 8A woman-owned small business, and we are on both GSA and the 8A STARS 3 contract vehicles. So that makes it a little easier to work with us if that's what you're looking to do. So little agenda for what we're going to cover today. First, we're just going to talk about, kind of how we got here and a little bit of the background of configuration management and how that's kind of evolved and changed over the past, 20 odd years. We'll talk about, the modern era and this kind of need to deal with both static and these ephemeral IT assets that are, may blink in and out of existence over time. And we'll talk about, how we move forward then, and how, the CMDB in a cloud environment really functions in a service-based operations model. So when we look at the history of CMDB, the CMDB really, I know there were times previous to this, but the most commonly credited origin story for the CMDB really comes out of like ITIL version 2. And so, ITIL v2, we're on ITIL 4 now, but ITIL v2, that project to do that revision of ITIL 2 started in 1999, and ITIL 2 was released in 2001. And right in between that period of time, we had this really big moment in IT operations, which was Y2K. Right. So, when a lot of organizations were kind of having this real, genuine panic moment, kind of realizing, hey, we don't necessarily know all of the stuff that we have and where and what the dependencies are and these things. So there was a big push to kind of, deal with that in that period of time. And so you see this concept come out in ITIL 2 of the CMDB, which is, at that point, this idea that we're going to bring in, every single thing that we have and create this logical model in a database of our real environment to be able to represent that in, logically, so that we can make decisions on it, right? And the ITIL 2 concept of that is really based on this single database that everything's going to come into, Remedy or whatever at that time, and it's all going to be in this single place and this single source of truth, and it's going to be great, right? And as organizations went out to try and do that in the ensuing years, a lot of them kind of found that there were a couple of problems with the theory there, right? And so by the time 2007 rolls around and we've got ITIL 3 coming out, we've moved on past this notion of a CMDB more to this concept of what they were calling a CMS, right? A configuration management system, and just kind of recognizing this idea that you might actually, almost certainly have multiple CMDBs that, you likely don't. It turns out that it's probably not realistic to bring everything into the same database because you've got HR information in some HR information system, and you've got some stuff in Excel spreadsheets and Access databases at that time, and various other sources that you need to really be able to collectively pull together into this federated system that you can use to, again, make good decisions, right? That's the core of what we're always trying to do with configuration management, or at least what we always were trying to do. Do you think that's still true, Rook, at this point?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
I think every organization out there struggles to have a good real-time or near real-time idea of what they have, where they have it, what it's doing, and who's in charge of those things. So yeah, it all stretches back to like the way that we've tracked all of this stuff has changed. And obviously that's why we're here today to talk about that.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And you're always dealing with this balance when you talk about configuration management between, the need to the kind of more is better concept, that having more data and more information, it's always going to help you make better decisions, and then balanced with the responsibility and the difficulty of keeping that data accurate and current and complete and comprehensive and so on, right? Because one of the kind of truisms since the beginning of this concept has been that if you can't trust the data, it's absolutely useless to you, right? That it's not one of those things where if your CMDB is 95% accurate, then it's 95% useful. It's if you've got 5% of the data you can't trust, then you can't really make good decisions on it. You can't move forward with confidence as you need to be.
Yeah, because most organizations don't know which 5% that is.
Right. No, exactly. It's not like it's just the things that are over in this room and we don't worry about that. It's just, yeah, exactly. So when we looked at it in that model up through the what I would call the ITIL 3 era, which was kind of 2007 to, I don't know, and CMDB, maybe the ensuing maybe 8 years somewhere, let's call it 14 or 15 or something like that. But where we start seeing this other evolution that happens, and the first thing that happens is that we start dealing with virtualization. Right.
Yes.
You see, and obviously that happened before. 2007 wasn't the first time anybody virtualized things, but it really started becoming sort of ubiquitous everywhere around that time. And so now we could still look at the CMDB in kind of the same model sort of evolved pretty well for virtualization, right? We could still say, okay, we've got this model where we're looking at what is the server is connected to the switch, is connected to the core router, and uses this database and this enterprise storage and so forth. And all we had at that point is like, okay, well, this server type is virtual, and we just needed to know, this VM that exists, what physical hardware is it on? And then you started ending up with these concepts like vMotion, where and redundancy, where you might have failover from one piece of hardware, one piece of physical hardware to another. So this virtual environment might have physically existed on this server before, but now we're moving it over to this piece of hardware. And we could still track all of that through, the CMDB, and we could still control that through change management. So it got a little more complicated, but it was still something that conceptually was okay. Right. Yeah. Like we could still deal with it by just putting a little bit more and better process in place, and we could still do those things without really, slowing everything down. And we got, all these benefits that you got from virtualization, right? But then, what happens next? Now we start to have, a little bit different modern environment. Maybe you can speak to this a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it all starts out with this big retail giant that everybody recognized, and they had their own pain points, and they learned a lot of lessons when they were running their own data centers. And they strike on this idea that at scale, this whole idea of virtualization then can be made into a service, and they could offer that to customers. And so they could even monetize this. So they started out with a service for storage, and it grew from there because more science had to happen before they were really ready to present to the world this idea of a rentable server. There was a lot of controls that needed to be wrapped around that, but cloud kind of evolved as a demand from the business, and enabling faster deployments, easier operations, everything that we know and love and kind of take for granted today. But layered on top of all of that virtualization, this automation that this Amazon was putting together in order to monetize and kind of publicize their services really has led to a change in the way IT operates nowadays. Everybody who is familiar in the IT from a technological standpoint knows that cloud is very different. We don't do things in the same way that we did in the data centers, simply because the very nature of this whole virtualization layer and the technologies that adapt to that layer now start to change the way that we operate.
Yeah, it's interesting, because that first iteration of cloud really ended up being, you got this notion for the business that, okay, hold on, I can just go out and consume, a technology. I don't have to worry about any of the underlying tech. I don't have to worry about routers and switches and disk arrays and so on. And all I just put requirements in and get, performance out and so on. That's the Super Bowl ad pitch to the CEO, right? And, at some point when that first came out, working in IT service management, my first thought is like, well, that's just IT service management. That's just what we were supposed to be doing as a profession in the first place. But we haven't historically always done a great job of that, right? We made the CEO care about disk arrays and such things, and so the idea that we could just kind of put these things out there and allow the business to consume and pay for it on a per unit basis was pretty tantalizing, right? And remains so, such that it's now we get to the point in 2022 where tail end of 2022 where we're just where this is more common than not.
Yeah, and with all the organizations now moving to the cloud, they're starting to realize that operations have to change. The way that we're running our service management has to change. And obviously, this is why everybody's here today, is to talk about that. So It started out where we had data centers where everything was purchased. We saw in the earlier slides, everything was purchased. It was scaled to be large because we had a whole department within our IT group that was capacity management, and they were kind of trying to predict how much power do we need in order to run the services that we need to deliver to our clients. That has changed because the way that we have now virtualization offered, where we can pay by the minute, we can spin up these assets as we need them. We don't have to buy and invest hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for hardware and have it sitting, resting, and not doing anything at 2 o'clock in the morning. So it has really changed the way business is now approaching items. Now that these environments are evolved to the point that they're scriptable, it's really opened the door to all kinds of things, such as now we can react to events where our CPU on our web server farm is high, and we just add more web servers to it. It was not something we could do back in 2000, 2005. This was not something that corporations could do. They had to have they'd turn on entire data centers and spin up millions of dollars worth of spend. So
sure, but I mean, that's a double-edged sword too, right? That when when you had to go out and, make a procurement request and cut a PO and order physical equipment, somebody had to rack and stack it, and,
Yep.
everything else, then
Took
it did
weeks.
force, yeah, but it also forced, a lot more active performance tuning and performance management when you couldn't just throw hardware at the problem, right?
True.
So, you do sort of end up, and sometimes enabling some bad habits where you've got, a piece of super inefficient code that this makes it super easy to just throw a lot of horsepower at it to power through, as opposed to, making it better. But that's, here nor there, right? You mentioned in this third bullet point, though, the multi-cloud architecture, and that's kind of an interesting thing that I've seen as well, is that, just about every client that I've worked with over the, last X number of years started out at some point with this notion that, we're going to standardize on, one of the big three cloud providers, right? We're going to be AWS, Azure, or Google. And
don't forget hybrid, right? Having a VMware cloud.
Sure. Yeah. But, we were going to standardize on one platform and, keep it simple and so on. And I don't know about you, but I've yet to see anybody that really.
Everybody's dabbling.
Yeah, everybody's got, a year later, you got stuff all over the place, and it becomes, difficult to kind of keep track of what's where, and mostly you find out when somebody from accounting is like, whoa, what is this number?
Agreed.
Yeah. So, okay. So then we get to this next stage that of, kind of the evolution of cloud, and then, thereby of our CMDB challenge, which is getting into these new types of assets, right?
Yep.
So when we talk about, a configuration management database, again, we're really talking about this logical model that represents hopefully your physical or virtual infrastructure, so you can, understand what it actually looks like. And it's made up of all these things we call CIs, configuration items. Right. So, what is a CI? Well, historically, simplest answer is it's anything that you care enough about to manage at an individual level that impacts a service. Right. So, a CI could be everything from a server to a laptop to a router to a disk array and so on. And, we always kind of had to manage, when we talk about, managing these physical assets at an individual level. The biggest challenge was always, okay, scope of CMDB. We probably care about, a desktop PC. We probably care about, that as a CI, but a keyboard or a mouse, we're probably going to see that as a consumable that we don't need to put an asset tag on and track and, open up a change request every time we swap one of these things out, because they're not something that we care about when it changes, right? It doesn't impact the service. One keyboard's as good as the next for the most part, and so forth. Something else. How's that changing now? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you say when we have these conversations with customers, what should I track in my CMDB? One of the litmus test items that I always throw out there is are you going to change it? Are you going to log into this thing, and are you going to execute a configuration change? You're going to update something. You're going to change the way it fundamentally is to another version of that thing. In most organizations,
you want to know that you did that.
Yes, exactly. You want to be able to track that, right? That's the whole purpose of service management, change management, so forth. But I'm never going to log into a keyboard. I'm never going to log into a mouse. A lot of folks, organizations don't track incidents on a mouse. The person walks over to IT, they hand in their mouse that's broken, they hand them a new mouse, they walk away. There's no documentation to that transaction. And rightly so. That ties into the whole asset management idea of, I don't care, it's a $3 mouse that we buy it in bulk. We have a box of them sitting there. So this type of thinking sort of like moves forward, and people start thinking, well, what do I do with virtual machines? Because virtual machines, technically, I'm not tracking them as an asset because I'm not paying per virtual machine. I'm tracking that cost from my servers if I'm hosting that virtualization in-house. If I'm running my own VMware cloud, if you will, then I'm already tracking all of those costs because those servers are up 24/7. The licensing is already paid for, so forth. So this
Sure.
question becomes very key when we're talking about things like virtual machines, and especially when you start thinking about the elasticity of the cloud and how we're constantly changing the configuration of a service. I may start out at 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe only 10 VMs are powering that service, and that's plenty of compute power for my customer load on my site. But at 8 in the morning, when load spikes, everybody starts going to work and start browsing on their phones. Now maybe I need 50 VMs. And how do I track that? Do I need to be having these entries in my CMDB? And I think that's the biggest question that I get from customers when we start talking cloud and CMDB.
Right, because now we're talking about these things, that blink on and off, in a cluster, or microservices, or containerization of and Kubernetes and so forth, where something might exist only for a split second, in some cases, and then it's gone. Right? Is that a configuration item? And,
Correct.
And that is one of the things that that almost every client wrestles with. So
I think
that you've got this concept here, that you've introduced me
to. So a real quick answer to that is it a configuration item? Yes, most likely it is. But do you care about it? Do you need it in your CMDB? I think that's more of the boots on the ground, rubber meets the road type of question that clients have. Do I need to spend all of this effort in order to bring all of those CIs, or record all of those CIs that are going to be in my CMDB if I'm never touching them? They're going to spin up. They're going to be terminated over time. And do I need to track those?
Right. Well, that's the other thing, is that, for years, my kind of go-to that, that I would explain to people when we were talking about scaling a CMDB, if I'm talking to a client or something, is that if something's a CI, it is by definition under the control of change management. Right. So if you're going to change that CI, you're going to need an RFC. You're going to have to go through that change management process. Maybe it's pre-approved. Maybe you've got an approval process tied into it. But your scope of your change management process is or was really defined by the scope of your CMDB, right? So that was a primary consideration. But to some of the points that you've made in other conversations we've had, I'm not certain that it's not that's not really the case so much anymore, right?
No, and I find that it's not. Most organizations with cloud, the whole purpose that they've gone to cloud is to be very reactive, to be very high velocity when it comes to reacting to what their customers need. That was the whole point, that developers got the credit card from the COO and they went straight into AWS and they started setting up accounts. It was kind of a gold rush sort of to the cloud. And we've moved away from this idea of having these servers that we've bought, that we've invested a lot of money in. They're stacked and racked in a data center somewhere. We've got specific names to them. Everybody knows the name. Everybody in conversations, they can recall the name of the server that web server or the database runs on. And everybody kind of reacts in that sort of a mindset where, if let's say the main database production server goes down, it's all hands on deck. It's everybody at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday trying to get that server back up in order to bring the site back up so that it's working. And that whole kind of fire drill, if you want to call it that, that really drove a lot of the change management. We instituted change management from an ITIL perspective in order to stop the incidents. Like, we need to track.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the light bulb only burns out when you flip the switch, right?
Yeah.
Nothing. We've kind of learned over the years to be afraid of change, rightly so, because those 2 a.m. nights in data centers, a lot of times we're triggered by some kind of a change that did what we didn't expect it to do, right? And we found out that dev and test and prod weren't quite as alike as we really hoped they were, or that, et cetera, et cetera. But so we get into this concept of pets versus cattle. So
so this was an idea that somebody put forth back in before 2010, where the phrase pets versus cattle comes up, and the idea of a pet being it's very unique. It has a name. It is something we're going to reboot, but we're always going to have it up. It's always going to be part of our architecture and infrastructure. Everybody knows it. this is where we're very careful with our change management. We're tracking it as an asset, very tight controls around this $100,000 server that we have that is operating our website or whatever it is, the service that we're providing to our customers. So normally,
gentlemen,
yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I've got some questions that I just put in the chat to everyone, apparently. I want to address a couple of things here before we get too far away from CIs and what you were just talking about. So we've got a quick question about the definition of a CI. Would we call contracts with service level agreements with cloud providers CIs?
No.
No?
No, because those don't have configuration. You're not going to go in and change those. CIs from from a ServiceNow perspective, ServiceNow drives a very large wedge between configuration item and asset. In my opinion, contract service level agreements, those belong with your assets because that's part of the contract, that's part of the spend. It's a support item. We're not going to log into a contract and execute a change to that contract. We're not going to have an incident on a contract. And really, that's where ServiceNow kind of draws that dividing line.
Gotcha. Thank you. And one more before we move on to pets versus cat. Oh wait, ooh, they're really coming in.
Yeah, they are now.
Let's see. How about, we've got this question from Lori. What about understanding what your environment was doing during a certain moment in time, i.e. resolving major incidents? Do you not need to know what was in your systems, or do you just refer to some kind of logging?
Lori, is that from a cloud perspective or from a data center perspective? I'm assuming it's more of an ephemeral question. Either, she says. Okay, so
yeah, both, right? Yeah.
From a cloud perspective, your cloud provider is probably tracking all of this. So you've got a logging service within your cloud that's saying this VM was spun up, added to the cluster, and then that VM executed, some sort of had some sort of an error. CloudWatch, for instance, and AWS would say, we noticed an error and we're terminating that instance. Then your auto scaling group configuration would say, well, I'm supposed to have 20 VMs in this cluster. I only have 19. I'm going to spin up a new one. So during that time, that should be in the logging of your service where that VM was spun up, had some sort of an error, and then it was terminated by AWS or Azure or Google. So this is normally where your cloud engineers are looking to find out what happened, what was up, and so forth. Now, in that specific scenario, your auto scaling group is using a template to turn up those VMs. So every single one of your VMs should be the same. And we'll come to this point a little bit later where, so if it's an issue that happens to that VM, it's most likely somewhere in the stack. It's within the infrastructure as a service stack that you are leveraging to run your services.
Yeah, I was going to say now, as you start talking more about infrastructure as code, it becomes, more and more paramount to have, useful error logging coming out of your DevOps stack, right? That we've got to be able to provide, good information on that. So,
yep.
Cool. Thanks, guys. I think it looks like we've got one other CI related question, and then we can keep moving. Kevin, I see your question. We're going to get to that a little bit later. That's actually covered in a later slide.
Yes.
Oh, did you already get that one, Rook? About
yeah, I just typed an answer to, and it disappeared from my screen. It disappeared from my screen. Where did it go?
It was around,
answer. It's under answered. So Thomas asked, what about mobile apps that are constantly changing as CIs or data? And my answer was typically the infrastructure that powers the app is CI, and the service itself is a CI that you track in your CMDB. Does that help, Thomas? Okay, Lindsay, we good?
Yep, all good. Thank you.
No worries.
But I want to go back to something you said a second ago, Rook. So that question about whether an SLA is a CI is an interesting one because historically we would have viewed the contracts or a service level agreement or controlled documentation as potentially a configuration item, a process doc and things like that. And so there is a little bit of a divergence in thought on that particular topic in current CMDB thought, I guess, is that most of the actual implementations of this, you're probably not going to treat those as configuration items because they don't change quite so frequently. And as you said, Rook, we're probably not going to be going in and logging into them. But at the same time, if you, I guess this is where you get into sort of a your mileage may vary circumstance, because if you have an environment where your SLAs are negotiated and are kind of fluid and are changing on a somewhat regular basis, if quarterly you're going and meeting with clients and the terms of service and so on are being renegotiated or adjusted and so on, and those SLAs are changing, then in that circumstance you might decide to make that a configuration item, right? Because it does impact a service, it impacts your ability to deliver it, and so on. So some of these rules are going to be a little bit different based on your environment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are other types of CIs that we would track within the CMDB. ServiceNow, from that perspective, is starting to pull in anything that can be changed. Again, let's go back to the definition of a CI. Anything that can be changed or have an incident opened against it is usually something we're concerned from a CMDB perspective. And in ServiceNow, the CMDB concerns itself only with the technical aspects of a thing. All of the financial aspects are stored in a different database for the asset management database. So this is where we, like I said, we draw that wedge between the two sides of the coin, the asset and the CI. And Lionel had a good question, certificates and keys as CIs. And I said, yes, these can be changed and updated. I can update a certificate. And without a certificate, my website in a lot of cases won't work, especially with the new browser enforcement mechanisms that are out there. So these could be very critical pieces to your architecture and your service to your customers working. So yes, I can change a certificate. I may need to update that and deploy the new updated certificate. So that is absolutely a CI in my database.
Yeah, absolutely. Certificates, domain names, those are things that I probably want to be CIs. I want it to trigger some kind of a reminder to let me know that this certificate is coming up for renewal in 30 days, so somebody can take care of it, that this domain name is going to come up for renewal, so we've got to go out and do it so somebody doesn't grab it from us or what have you. So yeah, absolutely, I'd want those things to be CIs. Yep.
So let's take a step forward and go back to the idea of these ephemeral things that are spinning up in our architecture that are servicing our services to our clients. And the extension of this pets versus cattle idea. In the old days, we knew what the names of our servers were. We referred to them, we logged into them, we brought them back up during an outage. In today's cloud world, that doesn't happen. So I don't log into an individual VM within my cluster and try to bring that VM back up. We just dismiss it and spin up a new one off of the templates that my engineers have created. A lot of times your cloud provider is doing this already. It's monitoring. If it sees an error that it sees is fatal, it terminates that VM and spins up a new one. That's what your cloud engineering team is doing in order to, from a configuration standpoint. Now, do I need to track it in my CMDB? That becomes the big question. It really depends. There are pros and cons to both, right? So if I'm spinning up from 10 to 50 and then back down to 15 and then up to 60 and then back down to 12, and that happens multiple times a day and multiple times a week and multiple times a month. If you're tracking every single one of those VMs or every single one of those containers in your CMDB, and it literally has a CMDB lifecycle of hours or minutes, then you're going to fill up that CMDB very quickly. And the question that I present to customers is, do you ever refer back to those records? Because you know exactly what's on that VM. You spun it up from a template. You may go back into your cloud provider logging system and try to figure out what happened that caused that VM to terminate, but do you even care? You have 49 others that are running just fine. Maybe it was AWS had some sort of a physical host problem where they had a glitch in the hard drive. It was detected. They spun down that VM that was being served from the sectors on that hard drive. So do you even care? Because in a lot of cases, if you're consuming and running on a platform that you are buying from another provider, you may not care what happens at the infrastructure level. And that becomes the key question. If you don't need to track these VMs, if no one cares, then turn it off. Don't fill up your VMs. Now we'll talk in a few moments as to what should be important, what should we be talking to. But again, if you're not interested, if you're never going to refer back to those records and you have no governance or compliance reason to track them, a lot of organizations will then turn them off for specific classes of VMs. Like I may have VMs that I treat as a pet. So I leave that up. If I'm running my main database server on a VM, that probably is never going to go away. It's probably not spun up by a template. It's spun up, it's hand fed. So we're executing changes against that server in the VM and so forth. So it's the cattle part that we are really changing the whole approach to the CMDB.
Cool.
Next slide.
Next slide. Okay. Sorry. There we go. So, these are, so if we're not tracking these things as CIs, that's been kind of the main thrust of what we've been talking about for the last few minutes is, what is and what is not a CI, right? Then what should we be tracking as CIs? What's your thought on that?
Well, again, like we just touched on, if I want to track a history, like Lori had said earlier, do I need to be able to track this from a monitoring or a logging perspective to be able to go back and say, during this time, for whatever reason, like a major incident, do I need to be able to pull back that information so that I can analyze that? And the answer is yes. It just may not be coming from your CMDB, because from a logging perspective, that's not going to be CMDB. That's not stored in your CMDB. You're going to be looking at your logging services, and hopefully they have statistics. You're running some graphs and everything that you can see. Maybe what your auto scaling group has as VMs over time, you can see a line graph or something like that. So we have a question here. What about understanding what your environment was during a certain moment in time? Oh, that was the same question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
It looked like it just popped back up. So yeah, that would be my answer on that.
Okay, cool. So, the reason that we are doing these, as you mentioned before, is because, the organization wants to be more agile, lowercase a agile, right? We want to be
flexible,
responsive. Yeah, responsive, nimble. We want to be able to respond to what the business asks for quickly, but without, causing a whole bunch of outages and negative impacts that typically go along with that, right? Because, again, that's always been the balancing act for an IT service providing organization, was this need to be nimble and responsive and agile, but also to be resilient and highly available and and reliable, right?
Yes.
And those things have been historically at odds with one another. That it's very easy to do one of those things, but it's very difficult to do both of those things. So I think that's a lot of what the promise of DevOps has been, is this idea that we were going to sort of combine everything together. And I think the reality, and I'm a little biased as an old curmudgeon dev or operations guy, but but a lot of what happened with DevOps is that we just sort of took that ops piece and moved it to somebody else, right? There are still a whole bunch of old school ops guys running around data centers and at Google and Amazon and so on, and doing a lot of the things that we all used to have to do in our own organizations.
Yeah, exactly.
But we as a society, I don't know, business as a society, we don't want to do that stuff anymore. I don't want to pay people to do that stuff anymore. We're gonna outsource that. Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of better options out there. And like you mentioned, DevOps, SRE, platform engineering, all of these sort of approaches they've kind of scaled and evolved right alongside cloud. And it has changed the way that we used to do things in an ITSM's perspective. You don't see a lot of monolithic sort of change requests for a build push in an organization anymore. Like if I've changed the versioning of my applications that power my website, I don't normally see them waiting until next Friday night to push all of that information into prod. This is all happening at a much higher velocity now with DevOps. And so our conversation becomes poignant, because what I used to track a lot of in my CMDB was the configurations of my servers, the applications, what versions they are. And if I push a change up, that version number should change. All of that was tracked before. Now a lot of times this is all handled from a large part of it. It's all handled by your DevOps teams or your SRE teams, your engineers who are literally, they're sort of managing at a different level now. They're not managing the actual server configuration. They're managing a configuration file that describes infrastructure as a service or cloud formation, Terraform, whatever the mechanism that it is that you use. They're tracking all of this within their own very well-defined sort of process. They're doing all of their testing, as you can see here on the screen.
Yeah.
And normally when we start talking about CMDB, it's at the deployment phase where that service spins up in the environment that I'm truly, from an operations and business perspective, that's where I start to truly care about it. That's where I'm tracking on a screen in my operations center. That's where I'm, that's where I care about that thing being up and available. So this is where a lot of times your change managers out there, it starts to change the way that you're doing change management, because your DevOps teams are already tracking that. They're already very concerned about their Terraform configurations. Those are checked in and checked out. They're peer reviewed. So there already are very tight controls around the change in your environment from that perspective. So do I need to track that in my CMDB? Is it possible? Yes, but do you need to?
Right, and we're not going to a CAB meeting. You're not convening
No.
a CAB meeting every time we need to, change one of those things, even though it is mission critical and a key part of infrastructure. That's a fundamental shift in the way change management has impacted or has worked in organizations for a long time, right?
Right. Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. So, I mean, yeah, it's definitely the way that this has come up. And this dovetails right into the question Steve just asked in the chat. The underlying assumption with a CMDB is to understand and control changes to configuration items. Correct. The purpose for this is to limit risk during changes and know how to replace failed items. So I'll stop right there and say that, most of the time, again, now we're operating from an infrastructure as code sort of paradigm where I'm not manually changing things in my environment. I'm changing the configuration file, and the configuration file then automates all of the adjustments and the redeployments, the spinning up new versions of the image that I'm going to run either in my containers or in my VMs. So all of this,
as a minor clarification on that, sorry, that to the extent that we are doing those things,
yes,
we will be operating this way. But we all know that the reality is that a lot of organizations are still going to have some data centers, some physical metal, right?
Yep.
And so in those circumstances, yeah, you're probably
change is
still going to be using
very,
you're still going to be using the version of CMDB, the version of configuration management and change management that we've come to know over the last 20 years. But the question is, how do we work in these other types of assets into that process, right? So don't mean to imply that the other process is going away. It's
correct.
Maybe eventually it will.
It just doesn't apply to some classes of changes.
It doesn't apply to everything. Right, exactly.
And ServiceNow has this DevOps change enablement product, and other platforms have the same basic idea where you're hooking into your CI/CD pipeline, and then you're, say, Jenkins, and then Jenkins pauses at a certain spot after everything's tested and ready to go. It will log into ServiceNow through an API. It'll create a change, populate that change. That change could go off and get the normal approvals from whomever that needs. And then once that change is approved and ready to go, then Jenkins will pick up the trail again and start rolling that change into whatever environment you're rolling into. So Steve, back to your question, how are you tracking service dependencies in the cloud? And this kind of jumps a little bit forward. Why don't we go to the next slide?
Certainly.
And this really kind of brings us to the next item. And if my ephemeral components are not my CIs that I'm caring about, my CMDB, what is? And ServiceNow answer that I believe is on the right track is we now track the service itself. And it has mechanisms, Steve, within ServiceNow that where I can say this service contains these other things, these infrastructure CIs or these other services, and I can link them to the services that are in my CMDB. So if I'm using, say, a database as a service, I can represent that as an application service in my CMDB through CSDM. And then I link that application service into the business application that I represent on a operator workspace here in such a way that if I tie into the event management system for my cloud, I get an event or something happens, an incident is opened, these services now at a higher level turn red, I action on that. And this is where we really start talking to clients about the power of the CSDM is kind of bringing organizations up to the service aware sort of focus within their organization. Everybody understands that we're running services, but now instead of opening an incident against a relational database instance somewhere in my environment, I'm now going to, as we encourage, open against the service that it powers, because the entire service is affected. And this is where application services or stacks, the idea of a stack in the ServiceNow CSDM becomes critical. And then we're guiding customers through, yes, we still have all these CIs, we're doing cloud discovery for pulling all of those cloud resources directly by API from my cloud provider. This answers another question that was earlier. How do we do the discovery and how do we bring that information into CMDB? Cloud discovery will query your query your cloud provider and create the CMDB items that it needs in your CMDB. It'll update those if you tie into things. Brian, next slide, please.
Yeah.
So if you tie into the cloud events that are happening in your cloud provider, you can automatically update your CMDB. And this is where you want to get to. You don't want to rely on something like a discovery that runs once a day or twice a day, once an hour, whatever it is that you've got it configured for. Tie into the events because your cloud already knows what's happening and it's already got a service somewhere in there. Amazon Web Services has the AWS config service. If you tie that to ServiceNow and ServiceNow becomes a consumer of the pub sub messages that AWS is already generating, then now we can update that CMDB record automatically. And we can do things such as tagging. We can consume the tags from my cloud server and pull all of that in. I can do queries within my CMDB and say everything that has this specific tag, such as application service equals billing app production, then I can group all of those CIs, even from the cloud, even if it's something that I consume as a service. And now I've got all of these as represented as services in my CMDB, even if I don't care about the VMs. I can see that all of the other moving parts, the relational database service that I'm consuming, maybe it's got a REST API that's part of that or some Lambda functions, all of those can have tags. And if I can query all of that and pull that into my CMDB, group that into a container of a service, now I can start tracking and doing ITSM things with my service. So I'm going to execute a change against this service, not this VM or this configuration, but this service. Because
right. So sorry. So
go ahead.
Just, I mean, the cloud tagging thing is, we could spend another hour, talking about that topic pretty easily. And obviously, there's a lot of meat on the bone here to dig into. But I think the most important things that we look at in terms of this is obviously we've got to have this kind of automation in place, as Rook was talking about. We've got to, we're not going to be able to manually go in and update the CMDB and keep it current. No. As events happen, these changes in state that are significant for management of infrastructure, delivery of service, then we need those things to trigger the automated updates and so forth. And we're going to have integrations. We're getting back to that concept of the federated configuration management system, really, because you're going to have some things that are, your bare metal servers that might be available, in your CMDB, but you're also going to have, integrations into your cloud providers, into these other your DevOps tool set and into that whole stack in order to be able to really keep these things current. So let's jump in and address some of the questions. We've got about 10 minutes left, so let's field some of those things that we have here. And by the way, for things that we're not able to get to here, as always, you can go to beyond20.com/blog. We have quite a bit of information available out there on that. We have quite a lot on DevOps and CMDB and so forth. Likewise, our YouTube channel, which is Beyond 20 LLC. So, okay.
You wanna make
Lindsay,
your way
you
through
wanna?
these guys? You want me to
Yeah, so
guide?
Kevin, did we answer your question about the tagging, tag-based mapping? The answer is yes. It's not the only way, but I feel it's the best way. And I have a whole presentation with clients that ServiceNow doesn't really cover, but I walk through clients through a tagging strategy conversation where we talk about how these are consumed, how they are critical to CMDB through this whole automation piece that that we've presented here.
Cool. Let's move on to, here's a short and sweet one. What's the best way to transition if you're not fully using the CMDB today?
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll jump in on that real quick is that, the first thing is to start simple.
Yep.
There's this temptation to go in and especially with automation to just go and pull everything into the CMDB, but you do sort of have that issue that once it's in there, you got to keep it current. As we said earlier on an earlier slide, once a CI, it's pretty well always a CI. You're going to have dependencies built on that. So, you want to start with the bare minimum of what you need to operate, and you can always add greater levels of detail as you mature the process. But start simple and grow from there. Rook, you may have some other things to add to that idea.
No, that's absolutely. You don't want to turn on a fire hose while the hose is pointed at your face. So don't try to do that with starting large with CMDB. Crawl, walk, run. It's always the best way to approach these things. My answer to your question is, where do we start to transition? I think that's a bigger conversation to answer that. Need to know a lot more about your environment, what your business is, what your concerns are. What are you changing today? What are you having incidents on today? That I think would be a much bigger conversation. Happy to have it. Let us, reach out. We can schedule some time or something.
And likewise, if folks want to see, how this is done in one of these platforms, in ServiceNow or the Avanti platform, you want to see how this really works in kind of a real world environment, we're happy to do a demo and kind of walk through and show you how that works. So please please reach out afterwards if you'd like to schedule something like that.
Yeah. Let me jump in, Brian. Stephen Dempsey, I know you disagree with the whole approach on SLAs, contract as a service. I would love to have that conversation with you. I would love to pick your brain and see where your perspective comes from, and because it could change my perspective. So if you're interested, you can email me, Rook at Beyond20, and I'd be happy to schedule some time just to sit down and talk through that with you. Because it sounds like you have a different experience.
One that, so yeah, Steve, I've known Steve for many, many years now. And yeah, I mean, historically, I've always been in agreement with that, an SLA or a contract being a configuration item, being part of it. So, that's what I was kind of getting at earlier. I think to some extent, some of that is platform dependent. Different platforms implement the CMDB in different ways. And so sometimes, what we look at and we think of logically as, from a process standpoint, this absolutely makes sense to have as a CI in some of the platforms is not particularly useful to put it in there because it's not going to do what you want it to do there. But that's where I was getting to the idea that, if a process document or a contract or an SLA is something that changes on a regular basis, it is a core part of the service. And if I want my support teams to be able to see it, and it's part of my response times, it's part of my resolution, then yeah, we can make it a configuration item to the extent that it's useful and helpful to do so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think my earlier questions were kind of ServiceNow centric. It's not something that's typically, it's not tracked in the CMDB within ServiceNow. There's other areas of the platform that manage SLAs or manage contracts, and that's where my answer came from.
Right. Yeah, I know Steve has done a lot with the CMDB using controlled documentation to manage the CMMI audit process, right? All these things that are controlled for CMMI, making those configuration items, so it's really easy when the auditors come in to be able to show a change history on those things and demonstrate compliance and so forth. So there are definitely some business cases to be made for having what might otherwise be somewhat maybe less conventional configuration items, right? So
Great.
yeah, yep. All right, what else?
Jolie asked the question she'd like to have more information about that workshop, and I asked her which one she was talking about. We've mentioned several. It might be the cloud tagging, or it might be CSDM, which
Sure.
for anybody on the call who don't know the term CSDM, it's a layer that ServiceNow is calling the common services data model. It's where in my opinion, the elevator pitch is it's bringing people and process into the traditional technology CMDB within ServiceNow, where we introduce services and so forth.
But it's also what allows, the platform to truly be a platform, right? It's you've got the common services data model, and that's what allows, you to use ITSM and ITOM and service portfolio management and HR.
Brings it all together.
And, all those things in a way that's really meaningful and useful at an enterprise level, right? Because it's all got this very, this common data model on the back end.
Agreed.
So, yeah. Okay, and yeah, on the workshops, just reach out, afterwards, and we can set up a call and kind of figure out how to get you the information you're looking for.
Awesome, great job, guys. If there's anything lingering here, we can certainly get back to you privately after this to make sure we've got all your questions answered. Thank you all for your time today. Thank you, Rook. Thank you, Brian. Recordings coming your way this afternoon, everybody. And have a lovely Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.